There are rumors around that this is Britain's revenge for the Boston Tea Party. 3,000 screaming teenagers are at New York's Kennedy Airport to greet, you guessed it, the Beatles. This rock and roll group has taken over as the kingpins of musical appreciation among the younger element. Some music critics call their harmony unmistakably diatonic. Others say it's pandiatomic. Parents say it's just plain pandemonium. Their first meeting with the American press brings forth an interview laced with quips and humor. You'd laugh, too, with a gross of $17 million last year. New York City cops are hard-pressed protecting the Beatles at their hotel. On every side, there is hero worship that recalls the heydays of Elvis Presley and Frank Sinatra. With one Beatle bedded with a sore throat, 3 of the quartet take an airing in Central Park. There was absolutely no truth to the rumor that the zoo's laughing hyena was driven underground.
60 years ago, the Beatles had their first US #1 with I Want to Hold Your Hand, Capitol's fastest ever selling 45. We're approaching the 60th anniversary of them first setting foot on US soil. So what could be a better time to discuss how they managed to pull it all off and storm the US? At the start of December 1963, the Beatles were virtually unknown in the US. Capitol had refused to release any of their singles, which had spent the previous year dominating the UK charts and being sold in unheard of quantities. I'm joined today by Beatles academic, author, and friend of this channel, Allan Kozinn. So Allan, how did the Beatles go from zero to hero in the US in such a short space of time?
It's kind of interesting how it happened. There was no basically US airplay to start with because there was no distribution for that single in the US. Previously, VJ had brought out some of the earliest singles and they went basically nowhere. They did get some airplay various places around the country, but they didn't really become the kind of hits they were in England or later would be in the US. But there was the story really pretty much begins in Washington, D.C., where there was a listener to a radio station named Marcia Albert who had gotten her hands on a copy of I Want to Hold Her Hand. Who had gotten her hands on a copy of I Want to Hold Your Hand and called the DJ, Carol James, and said, why aren't we getting records like this here? And Carol James looked into it. He had a stewardess from BOAC, or British Airways, I think as it might have been at the time, hand import a copy of the single, and he played it. And the switchboard went crazy, and it became kind of a big hit in Washington. Other DJs around the country got tapes of it from the Washington station, and the tapes began going around. By now, Capitol had decided that it would take on I Want to Hold Your Hand, but now they had a runaway hit when they had no singles in the stores. So they actually did a cease and desist order to a lot of these radio stations that were playing it, but the stations continued playing it anyway. The single ended up being rush released, just before Christmas, and it got tons of airplay all around the country, and it just sort of became a phenomenon. I mean, at the same time, Jack Parr, who had a late night TV show, had played a short clip of the Beatles in Britain, just a sort of a concert clip. I think he played a snippet of From Me to You. And Walter Cronkite did as well, and other people who had big news shows, would do this as sort of a human interest story at the end of the broadcast, usually with fairly snide commentary. But these crazy kids, and then these crazy British kids, and one of them said something like, "It's great to see that Britain has finally reached our cultural level," and that was supposed to be a sort of backhanded put down. But teenagers and maybe people older and younger than teenagers, you just were really taken with the sound of that record and went out and bought it, and it just became huge. I once spoke to Brown Meggs, who was at the time president of Capitol, and the question really was, what did Capitol do to make this happen? And he was pretty straightforward. He said, it wasn't us. It wasn't us that did it. It took off on its own merits. And, once they were going to be coming, we did all kinds of things with, store displays, with, Beatles bobbling around and Beatle wigs, and all of the merchandise got into the stores really quickly. And it just became, really an incredible thing. And then they came over to play on the Ed Sullivan Show. And that first show drew something like 73 million viewers, which was, a huge amount. They say it was a record at the time. I'm not totally sure that's true, because I've subsequently run into other broadcasts claiming a number like that. But, and those were also arts programs, which is sort of interesting. But
once Capitol got behind it, though, I believe they spent $50,000 on promotional activities, which was an unheard of amount for Capitol at that time.
Right. And you also have to keep in mind that $50,000 in 1964 dollars is something like $500,000 today, maybe more. Inflation has really changed what values are. But yeah, once they saw what was happening, they definitely got behind it. They sent out letters to record stores recommending that the clerks behind the desk be wearing Beatle wigs, all kinds of nonsense. But
They even persuaded the actress Janet Leigh to get a Beatles haircut as well, I believe.
Right. Yeah. All of this stuff made it a lot of fun. And that just sort of then it just sort of fed on itself. I mean, fairly soon there were Beatles gum cards. I don't know if they had those in Britain, but they're sort of like we've had, baseball cards where you would pay a nickel and you would get a little packet with a wax wrapper, and it would have one stick of gum in it and 5 trading cards. So they did that with the Beatles. Got lots of photographs of them in action, and or just straight portraits, and there would be a little bit of text on the back explaining what it was. And there ended up being, I think, 3 series of them. There was one whole series devoted to Hard Day's Night. And those cards, I mean, I was a kid in school. I was like 9 years old. Everybody had them. Everybody was trading them. Everyone was, looking at them. Everyone was going down after school, down to their basements and playing the records and picking up brooms and putting on Beatle wigs and pretending to be the Beatles. It was just, there's been nothing like it since, I have to say. I mean,
but
Taylor
the stage management of their arrival was extremely well organized as well. Their itinerary was leaked, so everyone knew that at 1:40 p.m. on Friday, their flight was going to land at JFK Airport, and obviously their movements were clearly leaked to everyone. So the route to the Plaza Hotel and everything, it was an extremely well organized exercise, wasn't it, Alan?
Right. I think Capitol probably didn't know what the fan reaction was going to be in the US. And so they would have told radio stations in New York, yeah, they're going to be staying at the Plaza Hotel. They're going to be landing at Kennedy at 1:40. And the DJs just announced it. So everybody went. I mean, apart from JFK being overrun with people waiting for the Beatles and screaming and all of that, once they got to the Plaza Hotel, the whole area outside the plaza was filled with fans too, also screaming and you know, and carrying on. There's a great film about this. I mean, it's fictional, but it's called I Want to Hold Your Hand. And anybody who hasn't seen it really should, because it captures all the aspects of the Beatles' first visit here, including the detractors, you know, which mainly were sort of teenage guys who were not keen on their girlfriends being so fascinated with the Beatles, you know. All of that stuff is in this film. It's a really fun watch. And it really does capture what happens pretty much.
There was a movement in Detroit, I believe, to stamp out the Beatles when they arrived.
Yeah, that's what I've seen the button that says that, you know, the Beatles, they stamp out Detroit. Um, but yeah, you know, there was pro and con reaction. I mean, there were people who didn't like them, and didn't like them because of their haircuts, or didn't like them because they didn't like that brand of music, you know, their particular approach to harmonies, the little, you know, woo thing that they used to do in that era. Whatever it was, you know, that irritated some people, they were quite vocal about, but they did not prevail, that opinion. So.
And how crucial was the timing of their arrival? A lot of historians have made a lot of the fact that it was coming shortly after the assassination of JFK, and America was just in the mood for something a bit more positive in their lives.
Yeah, you know, I hear that a lot, and I've never really bought that argument for a number of reasons. I mean, there have been lots of other terrible times when we could have used, you know, something like the Beatles, and other groups have come along and not had that reaction. So, you know, while it's possible that it, you know, to some degree that, you know, the need for something fun and nice and bright and cheerful happening, came at the right time. I kind of think that it really was the music, and it really was the look, and it really was just the whole atmosphere of Beatlemania. I mean, we didn't know anything about these guys yet. But you know, they were just kind of cool looking, and they went on Sullivan, they played their instruments, it was self-contained. You know, you read in some bios that you know, the Sullivan Show was just, you know, screaming noise. You couldn't hear anything. The Sullivan shows are out now commercially. You can play them and you can hear perfectly well what they were doing. It's quite a good recording, actually. You know, and everybody was just fascinated with this because we'd heard I Want to Hold Your Hands. By the time they came in February, you know, Meet the Beatles was out. Introducing the Beatles, which is fundamentally the Please Please Me album that was released on VJ, came out again, and all the singles from it. And so we were getting to hear quite a lot of Beatles music, very early Beatles music. Um, and there was just an incredible thirst for it, you know, you know, give us more of this stuff. You know, 3 weeks in a row on the Ed Sullivan Show was also pretty unprecedented. um you know, and you know, they could have come on every week for a year and they would have had a big audience. So.
Was the timing also pretty key insofar as rock and roll had become quite stale and predictable at that stage in the US? There's a lot of talk about the Bobbies, Bobby V, Bobby Vinton, and how sort of manufactured it had become, whereas this was something that was authentic. Is that fair to say?
um to a degree, some of pop music had become a little on the tame side, and the people you mentioned are good examples. But you know, there was also the early Beach Boys, Jan and Dean, the beginning of the California surf scene. um you know, Chuck Berry was still making records, Little Richard, all of the people that the Beatles had listened to and covered, those people were out there. An interesting aspect of that, though, is that in the United States, to a large degree, not completely, but to a large degree, radio station playlists were a little bit on the segregated side. I mean, we would get the Chiffons and the Supremes and a lot of the Motown groups, but they weren't getting quite as much airplay on standard rock pop top 40 channels as they were on channels that were specifically soul and R&B channels. And there's a really big degree to which the Beatles coming over and playing Roll Over Beethoven and playing Long Tall Sally, it's not what we think necessarily of the Beatles for first, because they were such incredible composers. We think of their stuff, but the stuff they covered, turned on a lot of white kids who were listening to white top 40 to, listen to what's going on in Motown. And, the degree to which Motown records were on the white top 40 charts increased, I think, because, it was sort of like, okay, this is stuff the Beatles think is cool. This is stuff the Beatles are playing. Let's go hear the originals now, so the Beatles sort of opened up that whole thing too. I mean, beyond what their appearances did for their own career, they kind of opened up a whole other end of the field for us. And so the fact that, the Bobby Vintons of the world were doing this kind of predictable, easy pop, kind of was swept away in this larger wave of the Beatles and everything that the Beatles brought with them, which included our own, American music. So there was that. I mean, it's a complicated question, but they had an incredible effect in a lot of ways beyond themselves.
That was a crossover appeal to both a black and white audience, which is a major factor for the spread of Beatlemania across the US.
Excuse me?
So it was a crossover appeal to both a black and white audience that meant that they could reach parts of the marketplace that maybe other acts couldn't.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure to what degree Beatles records were played on soul and rhythm and blues stations. I mean, there is a possibility that some of it was. I mean, we know that the black artists who the Beatles covered were really into them as well. I mean, you would end up getting Motown Sings the Beatles kind of discs of, each of a half a dozen Motown acts singing maybe 2 Beatles songs. And then, but when you get interviews with those artists as well, they would say, yeah, we're into this. This is good. We're happy that they're bringing our music to a bigger audience.
I think a key fact as well is that they'd spent the last year learning how things were done, how to handle a press conference, how to deal with the media. And most importantly, over the last year, they'd amassed an impressive back catalogue, which Capitol were free to use. I think 35 tracks at that stage Capitol had at their disposal, so they could cherry pick the best to release for singles and album cuts as well.
Yeah, well, what Capitol did is it had a policy, which was that, first of all, we don't have more than 12 songs on an album, because there were different ways that copyrights were paid in the US versus UK that sort of militated towards a 12-song album as opposed to a 14-song album like you guys had. They also had the feeling that American listeners liked a particular kind of sound, and that sound was very reverby. So the Beatles stuff would be run through an extra layer of reverb. And then the other thing was that they believed that singles had to be on the album. The singles were what was selling the album. So the first album that Capitol was going to put out was basically with the Beatles, but they looked at it and said, okay, we can only have 12 songs. 2 of them have to be I Want to Hold Your Hand and the American B-side, I Saw Her Standing There. And we might as well put the British B-side This Boy on the album as well. So now the first three cuts are those that were on American and British singles. That meant so three had to go, plus another two had to go to get it down to 12. So we're out five. So what they basically did is they took the cover versions off the album, except for Till There Was You. That one stayed. And so Meet the Beatles was basically an album of Lennon-McCartney songs and George Harrison's Don't Bother Me and Till There Was You. That left the next batch, the Beatles' second album. They took basically a lot of the earlier tracks and B-sides and other singles like She Loves You and I'll Get You and put them all there. And so that album had its own character because it was very heavily covers, because the covers were taken off of With the Beatles and then combined with the covers from earlier things and a couple of Beatles singles that were originals. So that album has no real analog among UK albums. Then Meemaw Capital is suing Vijay to stop introducing the Beatles because they now have the right to put out these things. And they put out an album called The Early Beatles, which was maybe, I think it was that one, I think only had 10 songs, all from the Please Please Me album. So the American discography on one hand was really a mess. But on the other hand, because you had a year or so of releases before we even, began to think about getting Beatles releases here, suddenly Capitol is able to sort of just throw all this stuff on the market. And, if you're just getting to know the Beatles, if you're really, besotted with this group that turned up on the Ed Sullivan Show, I mean, this was heaven because every week there was something new to go by and, more Beatles music. So yeah, it just was an incredible time, gotta say.
I did a great interview with Bruce Spicer, which is now posted on this channel, about all the Capitol albums and obviously comparing them to the UK releases. We talk of the British invasion, but in fact, on their first visits, they were actually only in the States for just over 2 weeks, in which time they performed at the Washington, D.C. Coliseum, Carnegie Hall, and appeared twice on the Ed Sullivan Show. But it was a very relatively short incursion into the US at that time.
That's true. I mean, it really was just an introductory visit. And, it's kind of funny because, Paul McCartney always says, well, we weren't going to go to the States until we were number one. But the trip was arranged well before they got to be number one. And if you look at the Beatles anthology, you see Paul say that, and then you see George saying, so we heard that it was number one in the States, which was really handy because we were going there.
It was really thanks to Brian Epstein, was it not, that he got the booking with Ed Sullivan, and then he used that to finally sort of pressurize Alan Livingston to start releasing Beatles records in the US.
I think so. I think well, the combination of that and the Marsha Albert thing in Washington and, just and some of the TV coverage they were getting, Capitol finally came around and realized that, maybe we can do something with this stuff. Because until then, they listened to them and they said, yeah, this isn't the kind of stuff we can sell. Because let's put it diplomatically, they didn't know what they were doing, but, they came around and,
So after that first visit in February, we go forward to the first week of April, by which time the Beatles are holding all of the top 5 places on the Billboard chart. Right. And that carries on for weeks and weeks and weeks. And then we're into May. Can't Buy Me Love, Twist and Shout, Do You Want to Know a Secret, all held the top 3 places. And then they're joined by the Dave Clark 5, another British group who had 2 hits in the top 10. So the British invasion, as it was in full swing.
Right, Dave Clark Five. I mean, Freddie and the Dreamers came over, the Stones came over. Suddenly we began to realize that there's like so much great stuff over there. And at the time that Capitol was resisting, I mean, apart from them just not liking the records or not seeing the point, was the fact that there is not a huge history and until this point of British acts coming over and winning over the American public. And it's pretty much a sort of macro version of the record companies in London saying, "So what's from Liverpool?" you know, this was just okay. Yeah, so what's from England? And we
And
found
what
out.
was it like when they landed and the first press conference they gave in the Pan Am lounge, and you heard their Liverpudlian accents for the first time? It must have been like aliens arriving from outer space to a degree.
It wasn't, yeah, it was, the accents. I mean, the British accents have always had a certain, fascination for us. And this was a particular regional British accent that wasn't the main one that we were most familiar with. But the other thing about it was their attitude and their the way of comporting themselves. We were used to, if you saw a press conference with someone like Elvis, it would be yes sir, yes sir, that yeah, I'm hoping to play to a bigger crowd, sir. And the Beatles weren't sirring anybody. They were joking. They had that sense of humor that is part of their personality as a group that immediately won everybody over. I mean, you've got a bunch of older, hard-boiled reporters there. Most of them probably assigned saying, "Why did I draw this assignment?" Go to the airport, see a bunch of British kids coming over, big deal. But then they're saying, well, what's the secret of your success? Well, if we knew that, we'd form another group and be managers. They had great off the cuff answers, and that won everybody over. All those old reporters, everybody else. It just said, wow. This isn't what we're expecting. They're not giving us the rote answers. They're not saying, sir. They're not being polite. They're not being impolite, but they're being funny. And that, those news clips went on TV news, and everyone just ate it up.
And then sadly, 5 years later, and they would go on to play their last concert on top of the rooftop pit at Apple. And what a 5 years transformation that was. It's hard looking back today at their arrival, for fresh-faced youths stepping onto the tarmac for the first time, full of hope and expectation to how it all changed over those years.
Oh yeah, and in that 5 years, I mean, just think of the musical progression. I mean, to go from "I Want to Hold Your Hand" in 1963 to "Strawberry Fields" at the end of 1966. I mean, that's light years of musical development in just 3 years' time. So yeah, and the from where we're sitting today, the rooftop concert was, I think, 55 years ago yesterday. So always lots of good anniversaries to celebrate around this time of year.
Alan, thanks very much for unpacking the British invasion for us today. And we're all looking forward to the publication in the not too distant future of Volume 2 of the McCartney Legacy. Thank you very much, Alan. Take care.
Having me, Colin.